It can feel kind of overwhelming, trying to keep up with all the global shifts happening right now, especially something like electric vehicles. The whole field is changing so rapidly.
Yeah, it really is.
And it's easy to get caught up in like the shiny new tech and the advancements. But under the hood, there's this really complex system and it kind of gets overlooked a lot, right?
Right, the battery supply chain. I mean, without it, none of these EV advancements would even be possible.
And that's exactly what we're going deep on today. We've got some really insightful research that zooms in on a major car manufacturer that was wrestling with some big challenges. Like, how do you even get all the parts you need to make these EV batteries?
Yeah, and our goal today, is to unpack all that complexity for you. We want to make sure you understand the key hurdles and the really creative solutions they're coming up with without, getting too bogged down in all the technical stuff.
So think of this as like your crash course on one of the most crucial parts of the EV revolution. And the main thing this manufacturer was struggling with, it all came down to actually getting the raw materials, the basic building blocks for these batteries: lithium, cobalt, nickel, that kind of stuff.
And it's not just about finding those materials, it's also about navigating the geopolitical factors that influence the whole process, along with the fact that commodity prices are constantly changing. And then there's the whole issue of transparency and reliability within the supply chain itself, which is often lacking.
The research really points to how opaque the supply chain can be, which makes it super tough to build a system that can weather those storms.
Right.
And when you only have a handful of suppliers to choose from, it creates these single points of failure. In fact, there are one case where relying on a specific region with all these export restrictions led to delivery delays of up to 3 months.
Wow, that's a huge delay. Think about the domino effect that has, right?
Yeah.
It messes with production schedules, customer satisfaction. It ultimately impacts their position in a really competitive market.
Exactly.
And then, on top of those logistical challenges, there's the growing concern about how these materials are sourced and produced in the first place.
Right, the environmental side of things.
Exactly.
You've got the impact of extracting these materials, the working conditions in those mines. These are big considerations for, everyone really, from consumers to regulatory models.
Yeah, for sure.
So you've got this huge demand for EVs, but the system for making these batteries is fragile and complicated.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
It definitely sets the stage for an interesting discussion.
It does. And that brings us to the solutions that were recommended by Cognitive Market Research, or CMR, a firm that specializes in this kind of supply chain strategy. They provided this major auto manufacturer with not just a quick fix, but like a multi-pronged approach, to make the supply chain more streamlined, but also more sustainable and resilient over the long haul.
Let's get into those solutions. So one of the core suggestions was diversifying the supply chain. What did that actually look like?
Well, the main idea was to move away from relying so heavily on just a few suppliers, especially those located in regions that are a little more, well, let's say geopolitically unstable.
Right.
So CMR basically advised them to go out and build relationships with lots of different suppliers all over the world. It's kind of like, don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah, especially if that basket's in a pretty shaky spot to begin with. And it wasn't just about diversifying geographically, was it? There was also a push to look at different materials for the batteries?
Yeah, definitely. CMR suggested that they look into integrating alternative materials into their production to ease the strain on those super in-demand resources like lithium and cobalt, the ones that are really prone to price swings and supply issues. They specifically highlighted manganese-rich cathodes as a promising option.
And why is that?
Well, manganese is more abundant than cobalt or lithium. It's not as geographically concentrated, which makes it, well, a more secure option, and potentially less expensive, too.
Okay, so it helps reduce reliance on those really hot commodities.
Exactly.
And another big focus was on ethical sourcing. How did CMR steer them in that direction?
Well, there were several key strategies. First, they helped connect the manufacturer with suppliers who had those certifications. The ones that prove they're following global sustainability standards.
Right, so not just taking their word for it, but making sure they've got the credentials to back it up.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about checking those certifications. CMR also pushed for these really strict due diligence audits. That way, the manufacturer could independently verify that the suppliers were actually walking the walk in terms of both labor and environmental regulations.
Really taking a close look at the whole process.
Right. It's about going beyond just knowing where those materials come from. You have to know how they were actually extracted and processed.
Yeah, to make sure those practices are ethical. Now, the sources also mention technology being used to make the whole supply chain more transparent. Can you tell me more about that?
Oh, yeah, tech played a huge role. It helped to boost visibility and the ability to predict and respond to potential disruptions. And a big part of that was the adoption of blockchain technology.
Blockchain for tracking battery materials. That sounds pretty futuristic.
It is pretty cutting edge. Basically, think of blockchain as a digital ledger. It's super secure and transparent. So in this case, it allowed them to track the raw materials in real time from the moment they're extracted all the way through the entire production process. And, it creates a permanent, unchangeable record of every single step. So it becomes pretty much impossible to hide any unethical practices.
Wow, so they can literally trace the entire journey of these materials and see how they were handled at each stage? That's a game changer in terms of accountability.
Totally.
And they also use those AI-powered predictive analytics tools, right? What was the goal there?
So those tools were mainly focused on two things. Number one, forecasting the demand for batteries, like how many will they actually need at any given time. And number two, predicting any potential snags in the supply chain, like logistics bottlenecks or problems with specific suppliers.
Okay, so kind of like an early warning system for any disruptions.
Exactly. And by analyzing all sorts of data points, they could make those predictions much more accurate.
And that helps with things like managing inventory and avoiding those costly delays, right?
Exactly.
Now, there was this other idea that came up, digital twins.
Oh yeah, that's a pretty advanced concept. Essentially, a digital twin is like a virtual copy of the entire supply chain.
Almost like a simulation.
Yeah. Think of it like having a video game version of your entire factory and all the supply lines that feed into it.
So you can run these simulations.
Exactly. You can try out different scenarios and see where the weak points are, before anything actually breaks down in the real world.
That's super proactive. So instead of waiting for something to go wrong, they can identify those vulnerabilities ahead of time.
Exactly.
Now, shifting gears a little bit, they also emphasize the importance of localizing production, moving things closer to the final assembly point.
Right. The idea there was to deal with logistical issues and also reduce the environmental impact of shipping these materials across huge distances. So the main suggestion was to build those battery production facilities closer to the car manufacturers' assembly plants.
That makes sense.
Shorter distances mean lower costs for transportation and faster delivery times.
And wouldn't that also tie in with the idea of a circular economy?
Definitely. The circular economy is all about minimizing waste and using resources as efficiently as possible. And for EV batteries, that means establishing really solid recycling programs so they can recover those valuable materials from batteries that have reached the end of their life.
So it's not just about digging up new stuff all the time.
Exactly.
It's about reclaiming what we've already used.
Right. Closing the loop, CMR helped to set up collaborations with recycling companies and encouraged investment in some really advanced recycling technologies. And that not only helps to save money in the long run, but it also makes the whole production process a lot more sustainable.
Yeah, it's a win-win.
Exactly.
Now, on top of all this, there's the whole issue of regulations, which are always changing.
Yeah, those are constantly evolving. So CMR really helped the manufacturer navigate that whole landscape. They organized workshops that brought everyone together, policymakers, suppliers, tech providers.
So everyone was on the same page.
Yeah, it was about creating a space for everyone to talk and collaborate.
To understand those current requirements and any potential changes on the horizon.
Right. And really importantly, CMR also helped them identify and secure government grants and incentives that were available for companies that adopt these sustainable practices, which, can make a big difference financially.
Makes those investments a little easier. It sounds like a super comprehensive strategy, hitting every angle from sourcing those raw materials all the way to what happens to the batteries at the end of their life. Now, the research also gives us a glimpse into CNR's process. How did they come up with all these recommendations?
Well, their methodology was really thorough. They started by doing a deep dive into the manufacturer's existing supply chain to figure out, where the bottlenecks were and the areas that weren't working so well. They gathered tons of data through interviews with stakeholders, market intelligence reports, and they also looked at what their competitors were doing to see, what the best practices were.
So it was like a full diagnostic checkup.
Right, and they did these really detailed risk assessments, too, looking at how geopolitical events and environmental factors could impact the supply of those essential raw materials.
Okay.
And like we talked about earlier, they used some pretty advanced modeling techniques to forecast future demand and run those simulations.
Right.
So they were able to come up with strategies that weren't just tailored to the manufacturer's immediate needs, but also aligned with their long-term production and sustainability goals. And they didn't just hand over a report and call it a day,
Oh, good.
CNR provided ongoing support and training to the manufacturer's team.
So they could actually implement these things effectively.
Exactly.
So after all that strategic work, what were the actual results? What was the after effect of all this?
The results were really substantial, like across the board. One of the biggest things was that they were able to significantly reduce their reliance on those higher risk regions we talked about. So the flow of those essential raw materials became a lot more consistent and reliable.
Oh, that's huge.
Yeah. And they also managed to cut down on production delays by 20%, largely thanks to those predictive analytics tools.
Wow, 20%. That's a massive improvement in efficiency. And that ultimately benefits the customer too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Less waiting around for their new EV. What else?
Well, by strategically placing those battery production facilities, they were able to slash logistical costs by, get this, 30%.
Wow.
And their recycling initiatives, they managed to recover a whopping 50% of those key materials from batteries that had reached the end of their life.
That's incredible. Half of the materials recovered. That's a serious commitment to sustainability. And I bet their reputation got a nice boost too.
Oh yeah, definitely. They were recognized as a leader in responsible sourcing and sustainable supply chains. And that led to some really valuable partnerships and a lot more trust from consumers. In fact, their EV sales went up by 15% within the first year of implementing those strategies.
That's a pretty clear sign that sustainability can be good for business.
Absolutely. And they were able to stay ahead of the curve in terms of regulations, too, which helped them avoid any potential penalties and even qualify for some pretty nice government incentives for those sustainable practices.
So all in all, they went from having a supply chain that was, well, kind of vulnerable and opaque to one that's much more robust, transparent, and sustainable.
Yeah, they really turned things around. They built a framework that allows them to navigate all those complexities of the EV battery supply chain and really capitalize on that projected USD 800 billion market by 2030.
I mean, that's a pretty big deal. It gives them a real competitive edge and sets a new standard for the entire industry.
It does.
What I find really fascinating is how interconnected everything is. You can't really tackle one part of the supply chain in isolation. It has to be this holistic approach, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
From sourcing the materials all the way to how those batteries are managed at the end of their life.
Exactly.
So, for you listening, we hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of the challenges and the really innovative solutions behind this whole EV revolution.
I think that's a great takeaway. And, it raises an interesting question for all of us. As more industries move towards these sustainable practices, they're going to face similar complexities, like how do you build these resilient supply chains? How do you ensure ethical sourcing? What lessons can we learn from this example in the EV battery industry?
Right. What other sectors are going to face these same kinds of challenges, and how can they learn from what's already been done? It's definitely something to think about. As we all navigate this constantly changing landscape of sustainable tech and these interconnected global supply chains. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.